All right, looks like we've got participants joining. So we're at 6:29, so we'll let some people keep coming in the room. Just wanted to go ahead and get this started so that you guys can all come in. All right, everyone, it is 6:31, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Looks like we might still be waiting on some people to enter, but we'll go ahead and get started just so that it doesn't end up taking too long. My name is Corey Stutz, and if you don't know me already, I am the museum curator at the Works, and so I focus on history primarily, as well as the art gallery. Really fortunate to be able to continue doing history programming throughout this year via Zoom. And for those of you who have been repeat attendees, I really appreciate your support and your attendance in these programs. Just a reminder, this is being recorded. So if you aren't able, or if someone that you know wasn't able to attend, or if you missed something or you come in late, it will be posted online on our social media. I think there will also be a link on YouTube that we can send to you as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There is the option to type a message if you have a question. For this Zoom, we did a webinar format, so you aren't able to unmute yourself or ask a question by talking. But if you do have a question, please use that chat feature. It's very easy to find. You should see it. I believe at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to type a chat message. And again, throughout the presentation, if you have a question, go ahead and type it. I do have it open, so hopefully I'll catch it. If I don't, I will go back through at the end of the presentation and try to answer any questions that I missed. For this one, I really will appreciate any sort of input and feedback, whether that be questions or some sort of story that you have heard or something like that. I would really appreciate that. So take a moment to familiarize yourself with the setup if you aren't already. Find that question box or that chat feature, and you can use it throughout the presentation. So with that said, everyone should be able to see my screen, and this presentation is called Legends and Ghost Stories of Licking County. So we wanted to get a little spooky since it's October. This is a little different than the types of things that I typically focus on, but it's fun to get in the spirit of Halloween. This is going to be a mixture of legends about Licking County. It is called the Land of Legend after all. So there are quite a few legends from throughout Licking County, and there will be a few ghost stories tossed in as well. Nothing too spooky, so it's definitely going to be fun for everyone, no matter how easily afraid you are. So with that, let's get started. The very first legend that I want to talk about is the legend of the Mason's Trowel. This story takes place in downtown Newark. Right around this place, this is the Hotel Warden. If you aren't familiar, the Hotel Warden was located where Wendy's is now in downtown Newark, on South 2nd Street on the corner with 2nd Street and East Main Street. This hotel was pretty big. I don't know how many rooms it was, but just judging by pictures and everything I know about it, I think it was probably the largest hotel in the downtown Newark area. There were several, and this one was pretty big. As you can see, it takes up quite a lot. Originally, the hotel started out, and this is a little bit of a grainy photo, I apologize, but the hotel started out as the Buckingham House Hotel, which was built in the late 1850s or early 1860s. I'm not exactly sure of the date that it was built, but we know by the mid 1860s it was already there. And this is a photo from a few years after it was built. As you can see, judging by the carriage and the people, it's definitely an older picture. So the Buckingham House was a modest-sized hotel on the same corner. As you can see, it had 3 floors and wasn't super big, but it did the job, I'm sure. However, in the 1890s, it was purchased by a man named Frank Worden, and he wanted to expand it. So he turned it into what it became. Worden added on a 4th floor, and he expanded the building to the east and to the south. So that's where our story takes place. So according to legend, one of the stonemasons that was working on the Hotel Worden was working in the 4th floor near a window, and while he was putting in some brickwork, he fell from the window, landed on the sidewalk, and died. As a memorial to him, some of his coworkers placed his trowel, or a trowel, one of the tools that the masons use to spread mortar, placed it on the wall, on the building. The legend said that they strapped it on with a piece of metal or something like that as a way to memorialize their fallen coworker. And the blade of the trowel supposedly pointed downward to the spot where the mason had fallen and died. Through the years, this story continued to be told and retold. It picked up steam, gained traction, maybe had some embellishments added here and there. It became a popular thing to try to spot the mason's trowel. It sort of started to turn into an urban legend, and as the years went by, of course, the story got bigger and bigger. I'm sure it was told that you could hear him falling, that you could hear the sound of the trowel on the bricks. Every person who would have told the story probably added their own touch to it. So this story went on for the better part of the 20th century. Every now and then, someone would come around who might claim to have remembered what happened on that day, but it was always a very hazy memory, or it was told to somebody and then someone was telling the newspaper and they didn't remember all the details. So it was always, a little bit was always lost in translation. It definitely kept a sense of mystery surrounding what actually happened on the site of the Hotel Worden. Eventually, the hotel closed in the 50s, but the building remained until the late 1960s. When they were tearing down the building, finally, they were going to get an answer as to what was the deal with this trowel. So when they got up there and they were taking down the building, they actually found that there was a trowel there on the side of the building. It was in fact there. However, it wasn't an actual trowel like we had thought. It was formed out of brick. So it was a trowel shaped out of 3 different bricks. There was one brick that formed the blade of the trowel. There was another brick that formed the handle, and then there was a 3rd brick section that formed what would be the metal part to hold the handle onto the blade. So this was a little bit more of a mystery, and people started to come out and say, well, maybe I don't know why that's there, but I remember some details. So eventually, a lady named Mrs. Robert Duncan, who was the sister of the owner of the Worden Hotel, Malcolm Baker, she was the one who said that it was fashioned from 3 pieces of brick. She said it was about 3 inches thick and weighed 5 or 6 pounds. They didn't know when it was put there or the name of the man who fell or anything like that. So this search continued throughout 1966 and 1967 to find out what happened. An article that was published in The Advocate on September 5th, 1967 claimed to have some sort of new details on the trowel. And it says an old timer who recently returned to Newark from Missouri may have shed some light on the history of the legendary brick trowel embedded in the old Hotel Warden, which was torn down in early 1966. It goes on to say that the gentleman didn't want to identify himself except to say that he was 80 years old. And he said that the legend was just as popular 55 years before, so around 1911 or 1912, as it was when this article was written. He kind of retold the story, basically said that a man fell and that they put this on there to memorialize him. And he said that he thought he knew who the person was that fell. The man, he said, was the father of someone named Hinky Dink Leonard. Now, I don't know who Hinky Dink Leonard is. That's quite a name. If you know who Hinky Dink Leonard is, or if Hinky Dink is one of your relatives or something, please let me know, because I would love to find out who this is. But that's who he said it was. Meanwhile, they still continued to figure out who was the one who put the trowel there, why it was there, etc. Well, funny enough, I found an article that was published 30 years prior to that, which claimed to have some answers. So in 1938, actually, a bricklayer told his story to the Advocate. And it says, trowel and wall was made of brick, Workman says. So this is 1938, 30 years before those other articles were published, 30 years before the Hotel Warden was torn down. So people's memory clearly is short, which tends to be the case. But this article says that trowel in the masonry high up on the brick walls of the Warden Hotel building has been explained, and the explanation explodes a romantic legend which has been built up about the unusual portion of the wall. So you can see by 1938, it was already considered pretty legendary of a story. It goes on to say, it is not a trowel at all, but a clever arrangement of brick fragments picturing a trowel. It was set in the wall by the late Frank H. Brown, a bricklayer, who worked on the job with George Plato of West Locust Street. Brown was the father of Mrs. F.L. Andrews of Elmwood Avenue and of Charles N. Brown of Clinton Street. The legend probably grew out of the fact that a bricklayer was killed when the walls of the Scott Building on Church and 3rd Streets, where the Pound Flower Store is located, caved in. Now, of course, the Pound Flower Store is no longer around. This was 1938. Most of us probably aren't around that remember the Scott Building either, but that was the intersection of 3rd Street and Church. It says, according to Mr. Plato, no fatality occurred when a story and a half addition was built on the Warden Hotel. So he remembered it, said nobody actually fell. Mrs. William Raybeck, 207 North Cedar Street, recalled the story of the trowel vaguely and assembled the details from Mr. Plato and her mother. So that would sort of be a definitive end to me to that story. However, it had gained such legendary status that it continued to be told for at least 30 years. And we started, continued seeing newspaper articles about it. In fact, Chalmers Pancoast, who was a local historian and writer, he wrote about it. He wrote a series of columns in the Newark Advocate about local history and a variety of different stories, but he included this story in his book, originally in an article in the Advocate, but then they were compiled into books. So as you can see, this is a sketch from his book, and it shows where it is. So if I go back a couple of frames, you can almost see, you can almost make out something next to the window here. And I just have to wonder if that is the trowel, because it really looks like it lines up with the right spot. So this was in the 1940s when Chalmers Pancoast, or early 1950s, when he wrote this. So it was still going strong in that point in time. Excuse me. And still, by 1966, people were still telling this legend. So this is an interesting story because there is clearly some possible true element to it. Someone mentioned that someone was killed in a collapse in a different building, probably around the same time. And there was a trowel stuck inside of the building. Nobody really still seems to know why that happened. But this is a good story because it sort of shows how a lot of our local stories and local legends that we hear are formulated by adding bits and pieces from certain stories. There's usually something that's factual mixed with things that aren't factual. And of course, as I said, every time someone retells a story, it gets bigger and bigger, more fantastic and more unrealistic. But this is a good story. So the next time that you are driving around the square, or if you stop at Wendy's downtown, first off, think about the hotel warden, because it really was a really sort of a central point of downtown life. It was a huge building, and it was very important in downtown. So remember that, but also think about the story. Again, we don't know exactly what happened there, but it definitely is interesting. Made for some spooky nights around the square, I'm sure, as maybe friends told each other the tale, or a parent told it to their child. So it's definitely a fun legend nonetheless. And here, just to give you an idea of the scale of the building, you can see it is that white portion of the building on the end. So it was pretty big, very important building in downtown Newark. The next legend that we'll talk about is maybe not one whole legend, but a series of places that have had some legendary status assigned to them. So we're all most likely familiar with this building, although this is a picture of it in its previous location. This is the Buckingham House. It is now the home of the Licking County Historical Society. It's not in this location anymore, but this is where it originally was, on North 3rd Street, north of Church Street. Was next to what was the John J. Carroll department store. This house was built in 1835. And several years after that, it was purchased and lived in by Judge Jerome Buckingham, which is the person that it's named after. And this is a really horrible picture of him. I apologize for the quality, but it was the best that I could do. It's from an old publication. But Jerome Buckingham was a really important figure. He was one of the founders and presidents of First National Bank in Newark, which is no longer around. It was bought and is now been incorporated into other banks, essentially now what's PNC. But he was a really important figure in downtown Newark. His home was a hub of social activity. He was a very, very well-known man. His house sat on North 3rd Street. Again, here it is in its original location. For over 100 years, it was there in that location. After the Sherwood-Davidson house had been moved from just a little bit south on the corner of 3rd and Church, where they built Park National Bank, they wanted to save this one as well because it was at risk of being torn down. So this house was moved and it opened. They wanted to have it in place for the city's sesquicentennial, which was in 1952. So it was renovated, turned into an office and event space and library for the Licking County Historical Society. So this is a picture of it being moved. It did have to be cut up a little bit and it was moved down the street. Some of the stories that are associated with this house started really at this time. Legend has it that there were a lot of issues that happened while they were trying to move the house. One of the axles on the truck broke. I heard that somebody was injured. They had some other types of things go wrong. It's to be expected when you're moving something that's that big and that heavy. However, some people started to get a little suspicious and say, well, that's an old house. You know, you have to figure 60, 70 years ago, there weren't that many houses that were over 100 years old because the community just wasn't old enough to have had that many yet. So for that time to have a house that was built in 1835, that was a really very old house. And of course, what do we assume about old houses? Well, they've got to be haunted. There have been a lot of people that have lived there. There have been people that have died there. And of course it's haunted. So that's when some of the whisperings started to take place. Eventually the house was moved to its current location. It's in 6th Street Park, Veterans Park. on 6th Street between West Main and West Church. Now, the stories didn't stop there. Once it was settled there, it's used for a variety of functions. People rent it out. Commonly, people have weddings and different types of things there. The story's been told that a bride was getting ready for her wedding, which was going to be at the location. And upstairs, they turned some of the bedrooms, which hasn't been, the downstairs has been renovated. If you've never been there, it's fairly open. Excuse me, but the upstairs still retains a lot of the small rooms and bedrooms. And so one of those bedrooms had been turned into sort of a dressing room for the bride to get ready in. And the story has it that she was getting ready, and out of the corner of her eye, she saw something, turned to look, didn't see anything there. A little bit later on, she did notice that there was a man sitting at the top of the stairs. Looked again, he was gone. Later, she recognized him to be Jerome Buckingham. There are several paintings around of different people, and it is possible to see a painting of him. Now, of course, whether that story is true or not, really none of us know. However, there have been several accounts of people experiencing weird things happening in the Buckingham House. Nothing that's been, dangerous or scary or anything like that, but definitely some weird things going on. So it could either be due to the house, or it could be due to its location, because that's the other thing about where this house was moved to. Veterans Park, which is on 6th Street, as I said, between West Main and West Church Street, is Newark's original cemetery. When Newark was founded, it was fairly small. That area was just outside of town, on the west edge of town. And so that area became the town cemetery. There were 280 some people that we know of that were buried there. However, by the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, they started to bury people at Cedar Hill Cemetery, and that became the city's primary cemetery. It was much further out. Back then, people were very concerned about having burials close to where they lived. And that was an actual concern, because during that time, we were having a lot of problems with cholera outbreaks. And so it is possible to spread cholera through dead bodies. And so they didn't want that. They didn't want any sort of contamination or anything like that nearby. So it made sense for them to have a cemetery further out from town. So that meant that they weren't going to continue upkeep on the 6th Street Cemetery. No more burials were allowed to be there. By the 1880s, they had posted signs that said family members needed to actually remove their loved ones' remains and rebury them at Cedar Hill, because this was no longer going to be a cemetery. Of course, there were gravestones and everything like that there, as there would be in a cemetery, but this land was going to be repurposed because it was now very much in the center of town. There were a number of ideas of what they would do to this. In fact, some people proposed that a city hospital should be built there. Others wanted all types of different things to be there, whether it was just a public park or whatever. However, the one thing that was the obstacle were the graves. So some of the graves did get moved. However, not that many. Nobody knows exactly how many were moved, but it's estimated that it could have been less than 100 that were moved. In fact, some estimates have said that it was only around 50 that were moved. One of the reasons being is that a lot of the people that were buried there were cholera victims. We had a really horrific, there were a couple of cholera outbreaks in the 1840s, and one of them really ripped through Newark. So if you have a lot of people who were deceased from cholera, if you or I get cholera, our family members are getting cholera. So there really weren't a lot of relatives around of some of those cholera victims to even be able to move their loved ones. So that's one theory as to why a lot of the graves didn't end up getting moved. However, they didn't. Some of the headstones were pushed over, the graves were just essentially buried, and many of them still remain there. This is a picture from a postcard, which is a little bit right around the turn of the century. Excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of my coffee. And you can see it was repurposed into a park. If you notice on the right, there is a small mound, and you can just see the last grave that's left in the cemetery. And here's a picture from Google, and you can see that. So you've probably driven past that many times. You might have even said, oh, that looks like a grave. Well, for whatever reason, that one is still there. So I don't know of too many definitive ghost stories. Of course, you hear things every once in a while. I did read an account from the 1890s, actually, that said that people would use this to cut through, and they would use it as a shortcut. And they used to see what they thought would be like lantern lights in the cemetery at night. Could have very well been a lantern, but they would attribute it to some sort of spectral activity. That's really the only ghost story for sure that I've heard of associated with that. But of course, you know, we tend to think of cemeteries being pretty spooky places anyway. Someone asked what was the name of the park. Today, the park is known as Veterans Park. So there is a memorial to veterans there. It's where the Historical Society has their, they have the Buckingham House, which is where their office is, and then the Sherwood-Davidson House, which is their museum. And then in this picture, you can also see the Heisey Museum. So they have their museum and office and everything there. So it's called Veterans Park now. And as I said, it's located on 6th Street between West Main and West Church. So definitely you'll want to visit, not just for the historic aspect of that area and what it means to Newark, but also just because there's a lot of really great things to see there in that park. Next is the legend of the Black Hand. Now, we've all probably been to Black Hand Gorge, or a lot of us have probably been to Black Hand Gorge. We might have heard about the Black Hand or wondered, why is it called Black Hand Gorge? But now let's find out the legend of the Black Hand. Of course, this is really the gorge part, I guess, of Black Hand Gorge. On the left-hand side, that is the area where Black Hand Rock was. Now, just to give some historic reference, Black Hand Gorge is east of Newark. The Licking River runs through it, and it's a sandstone rock formation, which over the years the river has cut through. So it forms high cliffs and sort of like a gorge area. Very, very cool, lots of trails to go through, so I highly recommend a trip out there. Lots of transportation history out there as well. However, when the area started to be more populated by European immigrants, they started to notice that, you know, some of the interesting features of the area. And one of the things that they saw was this black hand. So on the rock face, which used to stick out further over the river, there was a petroglyph, which is a rock carving in the shape of a hand. And it was approximately 20 inches long, is what most of the accounts say. It had an outstretched thumb, and it was pointing. Some people said it was pointing east. Some people said it was pointing upriver. So in any way it was pointing. There have been different legends as to what it was pointing to. Some people thought it could have been pointing to the mounds. Other people thought that it was pointing to a specific mound where somebody was buried. There are other legends that say that the hand meant something other than just a direction, but that it meant that this was a place where no blood could be shed, or that it was a place that was cursed. Eventually, there was a legend that sort of comprised all of these things. And so that's really what the legend of the Black Hand is. So this story, probably more than any other story in Licking County, has been told and retold over the years. It's something that has captivated a lot of people. And this story gets very complicated, as you will learn, and it kind of goes off the rails a little bit. However, this is sort of the oldest version of the story. And I do want to say, before we start, I don't believe, and I think that this is probably a little bit of a incorrect racial undertone here. This story, which mentions that American Indians in the area were scalping people. So I just want to say that I don't really know that happened, and I think that that's based off of a stereotypical thing that people assumed that people did. So just to preface with that. But the story, as was written, this was a story that Minnie Height Moody actually shared, that it was told by Colonel Davidson, Robert Davidson, who actually lived in the Sherwood-Davidson house. Don't know exactly who wrote this story, but it says, many moons ago, long before the paleface came across the great water to this land, here upon the bank of the Pataskala, which is one of the names of the Licking River, was the lodge of the great chief Palconga, whose daughter Ioma was fair as the dawn and graceful as the swan that floats on the lake. Her eyes were soft and shy as the eyes of a young deer, her voice sweet and low as the note of a cooing dove. 2 braves there were who looked upon her with the eyes of love, and each was fain to lead her from the lodge of her father, that she might bring light and joy and contentment to his own. At last, said the chief, her father, no longer shall ye contend for the hand of Ioma, my daughter. Go ye now forth upon the warpath, and when 3 moons have passed, see that ye come hither once more, and then I swear by the great spirit that to him who shall carry at his belt the greatest number of scalps shall be given the hand of Ioma, my daughter. 3 months had waxed, greater and grown less, ere the warriors returned. Then upon the day appointed, behold, all the tribe gathered to view the counting of the scalps. First stepped forth Wakanda, a grim-visaged warrior who had long parted company with fleet-footed youth and walked soberly with middle manhood. From his belt he took his trophies one by one and laid them at the feet of the chief, while from behind the lodge door, Ioma, unseen by all, looked fearfully forth upon the scene. With each fresh scalp, the clouds settled more and more darkly upon the bright face of Ioma, and her lip trembled as she murmured, so many, so many. Let me find the second half of this of this story here. It ended on that. So anyway, the story goes on. I can tell it to you without reading quite that version. So eventually, the older man, Wakonta, had got more scalps than Lacopus, who was the man who Ioma was actually in love with. Lacopus was younger, and he also tried to contend for Ioma's hand in marriage, essentially. However, the older one, was the one who succeeded. So her father had promised his hand in marriage to his daughter Ioma. That night, however, his name is Wakunta in some and Wakusta in others, so I'm not exactly sure if there's a more accurate. This is a made-up story as far as I know. He came out on the Black Hand Rock, which had been thought of as a place where it was almost spiritual and no blood could be shed there. On the rock, he saw Ioma and Lacopus kissing under the moonlight because they were in love. So this enraged Wakunta, and he attacked Lacopus. After he hit him and cut him, Lacopus grabbed his weapon and cut off Wakunta's hand. It was too late, though, because Lacopus, who was also holding Ioma, fell over the cliff into the river, and the hand fell with them. The hand clung to the cliff, according to the story, where it stuck. Unfortunately, Lacopus and Ioma fell into the river where they died. But the hand, because it was evil, turned black and turned into a warning. This place that had once been sacred was now cursed because blood had been shed there. And this hand was there as a warning. Now, of course, I don't know what happened to the second half of my story I was reading. My half was not nearly as poetic as the first half, but that's the story in a nutshell. So obviously that's probably not really how the hand got there. That's probably not even really a story that was told by any people of any tribe that lived here. That's most likely something that was written in the 19th century. However, it's a legend that's been told throughout the years and retold and retold. There's other parts of this story, though, that get really confusing and very interesting. It starts to intertwine by some retellings with the story of the Newark Holy Stones, which you've ever heard of those. Those were discovered by a man named David Wyrick, and he said that he dug them up in mounds, a couple of different mounds in different locations, and that they were shaped stones that had Hebrew writing on them, depicted a Hebrew person, and were proof that one of the 12 tribes of Israel were the first people to come to Licking County, and they were the ones to build the mounds. So there's some obvious problems with this story. That story has been debunked and proven to be fake. David Wyrick made the Holy Stones himself. It also is built off of a racist idea that the American Indians weren't intelligent enough or didn't have the ingenuity to be able to build the mounds. Early on, a lot of the history that we read separates the people who built the mounds from any sort of Native Americans in the area, from any sort of tribe, because the Europeans that came in didn't regard them as being civilized or advanced enough to do something like that. So a story like this, which is saying, well, it was one of the 12 tribes of Israel, is rooted in that belief, which is inaccurate because these were incredibly advanced civilizations that lived here. Also, we know that it was later verified that those were forgeries. However, so this story kind of intertwines with that in some tellings, because some people said that the Black Hand was pointing to a mound where there was some sort of king buried, and it was buried with these holy stones. However, the holy stones weren't discovered in that vicinity where that mound was. There are other stories that, and someone actually brought this up, there's other stories that the hand pointed to Flint Ridge. And one of the stories actually said that while you were at Flint Ridge, you couldn't shed any blood, and that's the curse came about because the blood of Lacopus was shed there. However, Black Hand Gorge and Flint Ridge, while they're sort of in the same part of the county, they're not really that close to each other either to be considered the same. Unfortunately, the Black Hand was blasted off in 1828. And in this picture, you can see why it was blasted off. If you look, there's a sandstone block wall along the bottom of the cliff, and that is the towpath for the portion of the canal that ran into the river. If you've been to Black Hand Gorge, you've likely visited the canal lock that's there. I think it's lock number 16, I think. So that was a lock for the Ohio and Erie Canal. And in a lot of places, if possible, they would divert the canal into the river, because if you think that's a lot of digging, and if you can save yourself some digging by using part of the river or part of a tributary or something like that for the canal, you're going to do that. So that's what they did in a lot of places. Between the lock and then there was a dam, it created a slack water in that area. So they were able to move the canal boats through there. However, they needed somewhere to have a towpath because the canals weren't flowing, obviously other than where it was in the river. And the canal boats didn't have any sort of self-propulsion. So they were pulled by horses, and those horses needed somewhere to walk. So in order to route the canal through here, and obviously they had to because they couldn't go through the rock. They weren't going to blast all the way through that for the canal. They needed to have somewhere to build a towpath. So they cleared out part of this rock face that hung over the river so that they could build a towpath. Unfortunately, we lost one of our really, really important and probably prominent archaeological things in this area because of that. We don't know exactly what the Black Hand looked like because none of us were here before 1828. They didn't have cameras to take photos of it in 1828. And that was just sort of the way that things happened. There were a lot of things that were destroyed, either for the canal or for the railroad. There did continue to be some petroglyphs in that area, I read. And then the last of those were destroyed when they put in the interurban tunnel, which is just a little bit east of where this is, still on the same area though. So that's super unfortunate. And it's really a tragedy that we don't still have those things, because there's so many unanswered questions. We don't know where exactly was the hand pointing to, or who put it there, or what did it look like, or any of those types of things. As far as how old the hand is, that's another mystery. There are a few different times when it could have been put there, or groups of people that could have been put there. Just the nature of where it had been, it probably, if it were very, very old, it might have not survived because of it was exposed to the elements and it's sandstone, so that does erode fairly quickly. It could have been, attributed to people who lived here from the Fort Ancient culture. It could have been sometime a little bit after that, could be around 500 years old. It could have been newer. We really don't know because, again, we don't know the details. Another legend that really doesn't make any sense, but is still somehow intertwined with the Black Hand, ties into Hernando de Soto, which any and all historical accounts say that he came as far north as what's now Tennessee. However, in the 1880s, someone made the claim that he actually came into Ohio, and that he was the first European person to see the Black Hand, and then it pointed him in the direction of wherever he wanted. He was looking for gold, and it was supposedly going to point him in the direction of something that he was after. So, of course, we know that that's not factually accurate either. It can't be. But as you can tell, this story, like the others before it, gets incredibly built upon and twisted and convoluted the more that it gets told. People make up reasons for things and like to tell a good story. And then here's another older picture of the Black Hand. I also heard that this is sometimes called the man in the rock. You can kind of see it looks like a profile of a man in the rock, in Black Hand rock. Of course, unfortunately, it's changed quite a bit due to the dynamite blasting, but still a really cool place to visit. Still very full of history, clearly, just regardless of what's been lost. Still a very historic spot and very interesting. So there are many versions of the legend of the Black Hand, I am sure. There are a couple of really great books as well. There was one published in the 90s by Aaron Kearns, and then it was he did an updated sequel. So you'll definitely want to check out those. You can get those at the library. Lots of really great information about that area. So I recommend those just as a side note. The next one, and I'll try to speed up a little bit because I am going to run out of time if I continue at this rate. The Goshen Ghost Bell. This one's an interesting story. I don't have a whole lot of pictures for it, and that's sort of the unfortunate downside of doing a presentation like this, not too many pictures to see. But this one is an interesting story. So the Goshen Ghost Bell pretty much takes place in Fallsbury Township, which is what I have outlined here. Just to give you some reference, if you're not familiar with where that is, it's northeastern Licking County. On this map, you can see Utica. It's kind of in between Utica and West Carlisle. This is a map of Fallsbury Township from 1854. And this is where we are talking about today. So the story of the Goshen Ghost Bell takes place at Goshen Church, which is the one that I've circled. This is on the very edge of Fallsbury Township. In fact, this church was actually moved. It's no longer there today, as you can see if we go back. This is the view of where it was. And in fact, the road that it's on is called Church Road. There's no church there now, right on the Waukatomica. However, the church was originally, it was one of two churches in Fallsbury Township that were outside of the town of Fallsburg. There were two more in Fallsburg. But out in the township, there were two churches. They were both Methodist Episcopal, which is Methodist. And the Goshen Church was originally built a little bit west, a few miles west of where this area is that's circled, in the vicinity of Gregg's Mill. So if anybody's heard of the Gregg's Mill covered bridge, that's the area that it was originally built in the 1850s. Several years later, for some unknown reason, it was moved a few miles east to the area that they called Egypt. That area, as far as I know, is not referred to as Egypt anymore, but that's what it was called. And as you can see, it's right on the edge of Fallsbury Township, next to the Wacotomica. So the story goes, this is as told by Minnie Height Moody. So she is one of my favorite people to read. A lot of people have a love-hate relationship with her because she did love to flourish or add embellishments to her stories, but she has a lot of great things that she told. So she tells of a time when she was a young child with her grandmother, and they had taken, now this was written in 1972, Minnie was born in 1900, so the stories of her childhood take place before 1910. So this is probably around 1909 or 1910. Her grandma had taken her to visit relatives in Fallsbury Township. They had taken their horse Ginger in the wagon, and they had stopped at this churchyard. They had stopped at the Goshen Church to have lunch. They had a picnic. While they were there, the horse got spooked, ran off. The cart, something broke on the cart, and it was just, they had a time trying to get the horse. Finally, they got to their relative's house that night, and Minnie was laid down, supposed to be asleep, and she overheard her grandmother saying that the horse had gotten spooked while they were at the church. She pressured her grandma, and she said, I was just talking, it doesn't mean anything. Well, finally, she got the story out of her as to why the horse might have gotten spooked at this church, and it comes down to the Goshen Church's ghost bell. The story goes that on April 6th of 1862, people who lived around the area of the church were awoken at night because the church bell started to ring. The legend, the story as it was told to Minnie, said that the church bell rang 11 times. They got up because it was in the middle of the night and it woke people up. But they thought maybe it could be a signal of something. Maybe there was something going on, something like that. So people got up. There was nobody that could be found around the church, nobody to have rung the bell. It seemed to have rung itself. Later on, as this story goes, they had learned that there was a major battle in the Civil War. This was 1862. That had happened that night. And it was the Battle of Shiloh, which occurred on April 6th and April 7th of 1862. According to the story, the bell rang for the number of men that had ended up dying that were from that area in the Battle of Shiloh. Now, there are some problems with this story because, as Minnie pointed out, the story said that the bell rang 11 times, but there weren't 11 men who died in Shiloh from Fallsbury Township. She had counted that there were 3 or 4. However, I tried to look that up and verify that, and I couldn't really even find any. That's not to say that there weren't any, but I couldn't find records of any men from Fallsbury Township who had died at Shiloh. There were certainly men from Fallsbury Township who were at Shiloh, but as far as some that had died, I wasn't able to find that. Not to say that there weren't any. However, this story was told and started to become a local ghost story around Goshen Church. Some years later, the church was torn down. Obviously, it's not there anymore. And the bell was saved. So the bell was actually, I'm not sure if he was the one who salvaged it, but somehow Floyd McKenna, if anyone is familiar with who that is, the bell came into his possession. He owned the Mabel's shoe store downtown on 3rd Street. And so he had kept the bell in the shoe store. And in fact, he had contacted Minnie Height Moody after she said something about it and said, well, I've got the bell. What do you know about this? I don't know what happened to the bell now. I would love to find out where that bell is. However, it's the only probably remaining bit of a local ghost story that took place in that area. So if anybody has any more information about that bell or about the Goshen Church in general, or if you're from that area, or if you've heard some version of that story, let me know, because I would love to hear it. But it definitely spooked Minnie Height Moody. It's something that she remembered all the way until her adulthood. And later she wrote that there were several people who were writing her to tell their own version of the story. So it seems like everybody had sort of a little bit of their own twist on it. But it was definitely something that had been told throughout the area. The next one, the Johnstown Witch. Some of you might have heard of this. Some of you maybe haven't heard of it. The story of the Johnstown Witch actually doesn't take place in Johnstown, but it's more in Concord, which is really not much of a town anymore, but it was just east of Johnstown. Here you can see this is a map from the 1850s, and you can see where Johnstown is. It's the kind of big grid on the left. Just a little bit to the right of it, you can kind of see over here, this is the village of Concord. And in Concord Cemetery lies the grave of a girl whose name was Sarah Lavina Emerson. Here you can see her grave. She died in 1846, aged 13 years, 11 months, and 27 days. It says on her grave. She was just shy of her 14th birthday, sorry. So the story goes, and why would this young girl be called the Johnstown Witch? The story goes that throughout Sarah's life, she was, many say that she was incredibly beautiful. She was just sort of the ideal young girl. However, she was subject to these fits of rage or fits of some other nature. Many people believe that she was, in fact, possessed by the devil, that she had some sort of evil within her, or that she was a witch. There's all sorts of things that were attributed to her. People would make up stories, I'm sure, about her, or say that she was behind something that had happened, or some tragedy that had befallen somebody. Eventually, the story goes that she set her house on fire and ended up dying in the fire. Some people say that it was an outburst of rage, engulfed her home in flames. Others say that somebody came and set the house to get rid of her. Other people have a more practical solution, that maybe her skirt caught in the fireplace or something like that. In any regard, supposedly she burnt up in her house. Her parents, shortly afterwards, sometime in the 1850s, are said to have left and headed west. Now, just to give you some reference, this is that same map that we showed. I highlighted in red where the Emersons lived. She was the daughter of Jasper and Eliza Emerson, and this is the Emerson property. And in fact, today, this is it. If anybody's been to Swalper's Day out on Sportsman Club Road, that is the north part of the old Emerson property. The Emersons had 100 acres, so the back part of it is still a farm, but the front is Swalper's Day. So there's a lot of versions of this story, and one of the things that still kind of intrigues people, because the story gets told and passed on, sometimes if you go to the cemetery, people will leave gifts at Sarah's grave. There's something that kind of helps to push the story onward, though, and that's an inscription that's on her grave. So on the back of, if we go back to her grave here, this is the front where it says her name. Died August 1st, 1847. or that might be August 4th, actually, 1847. Sarah Lavina, daughter of Jasper and Eliza Emerson. But on the back of her grave is an inscription, and it says, "Young people all, as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, you soon will be. Prepare for death and follow me. My dust is smoldering back to dust, my soul return to God. May those who read know soon they must, like hold beneath the sod. Oh, monster death, why blast so soon the flower that just began to bloom? But boast thou now, well not complain, for Sarah soon shall rise again. Then in that resurrection morn, we all shall meet her in the sky. From our cold graves, dark and forlorn, we'll bask in scenes that never die." So obviously this poem, there's definitely a little bit of a macabre element to it. Of course, it's not talking about Sarah's body rising from the grave in a literal sort of zombie sense. There's definitely a religious element to it. However, for someone just passing by, having heard that this was a witch who in some fit of rage combusted herself and burnt her house down, you might get a little scared by reading some of those stories that you're also about to die and she's going to come back from the dead. So it's a bit of a creepy story for sure. This poem was actually written by D. Stockwell, and there's another Stockwell who was a man named Eli Stockwell, whose daughter was the only other 13-year-old girl who was buried in Concord Cemetery. So it's possible that this Stockwell person who wrote this poem that's on her grave was associated with that and would have also known sort of the pain that comes along with losing someone so young. This story, though, is really most likely if Sarah Emerson did have any sort of outbursts. Unfortunately, it was probably something due to whether she dealt with some sort of mental illness or something like that. And during that time, that was obviously not understood. So there could be some sort of truth rooted in that as to some reason, as to whether or not she actually burnt her house down or died in a fire like that. It's pretty far back. It's a little bit difficult to verify. Obviously, we did have newspapers then, but this was still a very rural area in the time, and whether or not it would have been written about is hard to tell. However, this is a story that has persisted, and if you do a Google search on the Johnstown Witch, you will still see stories where people are talking about it. You will find YouTube videos that people have made. You will find things where people have gone on ghost hunt type of things to try to find some evidence of Sarah's ghost in the cemetery. So this is a pretty persistent story. And again, it's one where there might be some sort of truth involved, but a lot of it's probably just a story that continues to be told year after year, especially around Halloween time. However, if you have any version of the story, please let me know, because I would love to hear it. All right, so finally, we're going to go a different route in the supernatural. Many of you might not have heard, but we had our very own UFO sighting in Newark, in downtown Newark, in 1887. So this is the viewpoint. Of course, I don't have any pictures for this, unfortunately. I would love if someone had a picture of this UFO. However, this is sort of the perspective that's described as viewing this from. So this actually took place on June 23rd of 1887. So that's very far back. We tend to think of UFO stories as coming post-Roswell, especially popular mid-20th century. But there were unexplained sightings that were happening before that. So this was published in the Newark Advocate on the 24th, on June 24th of 1887. And this says, at 10:30 Thursday night was witnessed a remarkable phenomenon in the northwestern heavens. It began soon after 10 and continued until 11, the spectacle of hundreds of people. The nature of this phenomenon was a brilliant hanging light standing in the northwestern heavens about 25 degrees from the horizon. Its motion was very strange and mysterious. It had a tendency to go down below the horizon and seemed to descend rapidly in a straight line downward, though apparently traveling to the north. A close observer of the trembling traveler saw some very peculiar movements of the stranger. The object itself was almost as large as a small electric light, and it danced through the darkness of the heavens like a wandering spirit of fire. Sometimes it would pitch rapidly forward, and its descent could be plainly seen by the beholder. Then it would appear to have turned clear around, making such a rapid revolution as to cause it to turn several somersaults, as it were. In these movements, there would be a change of the color of the lights. In the center, a deep red light was noticeable at what appeared to be a revolution of the object. Then other lights of various colors would flash up, and a long line of arc, like a silvery thread, would stream up from a central point after the manner of a star. At least 3 different kinds of lights were visible. No distinct shape could be made out by anybody. A great many supposed it was the famous world balloon, but this cannot be because the balloon had not started from St. Louis as yet. No basket could be seen attached to this strange visitor, and the closest scrutiny could reveal nothing but a red ball of fire, which would be speedily hidden behind the greater glow of light sent out from the center. The object seemed to hang just over Swisher's cigar establishment, and when it dropped, disappeared just below the old cemetery in the northwest. So we just talked about the cemetery a little bit ago. It is certainly a wonderful thing, this strange ball of fire silently and swiftly crossing the heavens and dropping out of sight in the same mysterious manner it came into this sight. So they clearly were very puzzled as to what this could have been. This was still fairly early in time. Electricity was not a common thing. For it to have been some sort of electric light really wouldn't have been possible because it just wasn't really available. We were just starting to get electricity in Newark at this time. And those lights were very few and far between. Now, they mentioned Swishers, just to give you some perspective of where the sighting really was, this perspective was written from. So this is West Main Street, and we're looking west. And the building, if you can see, it says Sam Albin's Furniture Store. Now it's a pharmacy, but that was originally the cigar factory for Swisher Brothers Cigars. And this is just a cool little drawing that was printed in 1883, I think was the year when this was put there. This is what it looks like now. But that gives you some perspective as to what they were looking at. And then they referenced the cemetery as well. So it was looking west, and it was kind of dipping up and down through there. Now, prepare yourself for this very professional recreation of what this might have looked like at nighttime. I know this is really impressive, but I wanted to give some sort of idea of maybe where this UFO/light was seen. So it was somewhere in that vicinity. Obviously, probably didn't look much like that, but that's the best I could do to give you a good idea of where this UFO was. So again, as I said, this was published in the Newark Advocate. It happened June 23rd, 1887. So that's quite a long time ago, before people were really even coming up with ideas of what a UFO was, or that it was something. I think it's interesting that it mentions that it seemed to have different lights. It possibly was seeming to rotate, went up and down as well as backwards and forwards, and it was really around for an hour. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, we just had a really interesting thing happen where there was a huge ball of fire in the sky a couple of weeks or 2 ago in the early morning. Some of you might not have seen that, but it was on the news, and many people I know saw it early in the morning. So it's possible that there was some sort of astronomical event, of course. But what that was, we don't know, and they didn't know obviously back then either. So sort of an unknown thing that occurred, and a lot of people saw in downtown Newark at the time. Unfortunately, I couldn't really find much more about this than just that one story, but it is certainly interesting. So with that, I would like to say thank you for taking part in this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. You can also email me or give me a phone call. My email is corey.stutz@theworks.org. or you're also welcome to give me a phone call. And I'd be happy to help you if you have any questions about anything, or if you would like to share some rendition of a story that you had heard. Again, as I said, this is a little bit different than the types of historical things that I generally share in these presentations, but we did want to kind of do something a little bit fun and in keeping with the spirit of Halloween. So keep your eyes out. We are going to be doing History at Home in the coming months as well. We also have several other opportunities for you to take part in works programs at home. We have a lot of works at home kits that are available. You can check out what's available each month to take home. We've also been doing STEM kit giveaways, so check those out if you're going to be in your community. There's a variety of works at home programs that you can take part in. We are also open to the public. Once again, finally, we are open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We do ask that you pre-purchase your tickets online. You can go to our website attheworks.org to choose your time slot and get your tickets there. But please come and visit us. We are happy to welcome you all back into the building again. Again, we're open Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. There are 2 time slots each day for you to choose, so we can't wait to see all of your smiling, wonderful faces at the works. If you would like, I can stick around to answer questions, but if you don't have any questions, then we can end it. You're welcome to leave if you don't have a question. Thank you all for your feedback and for your participation again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your month.